So I was raised in a not very, but a Christian household, so a Protestant Christian household. Um, and I was baptized in a Lutheran church. My parents both attended the Lutheran church, and I went to Sunday school every Sunday, so it was pretty structured. Um, my father had been raised Methodist and my mother had been raised Lutheran. And so my 3 siblings, and I were all also confirmed in the Lutheran church, which meant that we had to go to confirmation classes for 2 years, all through middle school, and had to go through a whole confirmation ceremony. But I grew up in a neighborhood that was primarily Jewish. So that was a pretty prominent culturally, that was a prominent religious influence in my life. And as you know, my mother's family had strong Jewish roots also. So my great-great-grandmother was the last person in my family who claimed her Jewish heritage and fled Eastern Europe due to pogroms. And then when the family moved to the United States, they sort of hid their Jewish identity. So that became sort of an culturally interesting influence in my life as well. Let's see, my generation of friends, we were all born in the late 1960s. And my friends' grandparents, and in some cases, some of the older parents, but I knew a number of grandparents who were survivors of the camps. And I remember very well growing up and seeing, their tattoo, numbers on their arms from the camps. I grew up in a really in a university town, very intellectual academic community, and that's where most of my Jewish friends, their parents were professors at the university, and so they were a very tight-knit community, and they belonged to two temples. One was a conservative Jewish temple called Temple Beth Israel, and the other one is a Reformed Jewish temple called Temple Bethel. So it was just like such a big part of every part of my culture, because I grew up in the neighborhood where a lot of the university professors lived, and it just so happened to be the neighborhood that also attracted most of the Jewish parents and kids. I grew up in the Midwest, as you know, in Madison, Wisconsin, which is a very Protestant, very white, the Midwest, very Protestant and white, and some Catholicism. But in my little pocket where I grew up, again, I was in the minority, which was really funny because my friends would come over to my house for Christmas, or around Christmas time during the holidays, and they thought it was like really exotic to frost Christmas cookies, and they loved to come over and just like kind of hang out and do a lot of these sorts of rituals that we had, but found it sort of odd, while also recognizing that they were very much in the cultural minority in Wisconsin. So it was a very interesting dynamic there, because my friends were educating me in terms of the ways in which their community and their culture was really minoritized in the space of the Midwest, and actually the country and the world as a whole. I remember when my best friend Miriam asked me when we were 10 years old, probably, if there were another Holocaust, if I would hide her and her family in our house. And I remember that being really, really striking to me, and really kind of drove home I didn't understand it this way at the time, but the privilege that I had in being part of very much of my majority culture. But I wasn't necessarily questioning like the existence of God at the time, and it just was so much built into, again, the ideology, the belief system of my mother, and she wasn't sort of shoving it down our throats. There was a lot of like ritual around it for us, and it was sort of lovely, and it was sort of fun, and there wasn't any kind of, it didn't come with a lot of strictness in terms of like rules and mores. It had more to do with like sort of, the candles and the music. And what I came to kind of understand later on as I talked to my family members and my mother before she died was that I think, interestingly, I think a lot of this was sort of a kind of intergenerational cultural expression of their religious pluralism, because I grew up actually in a household where my mother spoke a little bit of Yiddish, and at Christmas time, we would have latkes, and it's sort of interesting to look back now because she was very drawn to the community and to the neighborhood where I grew up. She was the one who made the choice of the neighborhood where she and my father moved, and she also surrounded herself with a lot of Jewish friends. And so sometimes I've wondered if there was something sort of familiar for her about that. And some of our rituals were definitely, I think, there was this sort of interesting hybrid. So I found, having to go to confirmation class and things like that, that was the point at which I was like, oh, I think I'm kind of done with some of the structure around some of the, the sacraments and the rituals of Christianity. But it wasn't until I went to college and moved to a much more homogenous community in Minnesota. I actually ended up going to St. Olaf College, which is a Lutheran college, and I didn't go to St. Olaf because it was Lutheran. I went because it was a good small liberal arts college and it was affordable for my family. And it was there that I just suddenly, again, it was so much more homogenous. Most of the people in that community were Lutheran, and I suddenly started feeling some of the oppressiveness of the institution itself, and was running into, a lot of hypocrisy. And really it was through that process of kind of coming to terms with this Lutheran campus and Lutheran culture that I moved away from there. And it was around that time too that I ended up studying liberation theology and did an abroad program in Mexico. And I realized what I was drawn to in religion was really the activism and the community support, which was something that I know that my Jewish friends and that community had really instilled in me, a really strong social justice component that I certainly had lost the thread of in terms of Protestant Christianity. So it was around then that I really tried to distance myself from Christianity and that culture. I do think that I was really impacted by studying liberation theology in Mexico. I ended up talking to, liberation theology is really based in a Catholic, in Catholic religion. So it wasn't so much Catholicism that it was interesting to me, but in particular, this commitment to social justice and the preferential option for the poor, which really drew me. And that's one of the tenets of liberation theology, and a particular part of Catholicism. It's interesting because I have now been teaching for 20 years at a Jesuit institution. And so that's another through line for me in terms of my vocational goals, was towards, this focus on social justice. So I met a lot of very, very, religiously oriented people whose commitment to Catholicism was based in social justice, and in definitely kind of the Jesuit branch of Catholicism. So then after I graduated from college, I was, I don't know what I would say in terms of like my belief structure. I had definitely moved away from a Protestant orientation, but I was recognizing that I was very much a spiritual person, and that was something that my mother really helped me identify, because coincidentally my mother became a hospice nurse around the same time that I was becoming more of a political activist. And she left hospital nursing and joined a really grassroots hospice movement in Wisconsin. So it wasn't in the mainstream yet. And she joined kind of on a volunteer basis with some activist nurses. And she did that because of her commitment to social justice. And she was really, a very, very spiritual person. But I was understanding at the time that it wasn't so much connected to the institution of the Lutheran Church. It was just like, it was the way that she lived in the world. And so she spent, the next 15 years, really until the end of her life, helping people through their process of dying, which is an incredibly spiritual kind of practice and commitment. And so she and I really started talking much more about our shared spirituality. And she was kind of sad that I wasn't sort of practicing, Christianity anymore. But I remember having this conversation with her, particularly when I was in graduate school, about how I was a very spiritual person and finding some common ground there. And then when I was in grad school, I continued to travel in Latin America and South America in particular because of my experiences in Mexico. And so I encountered a lot of Catholicism, but I also encountered, the ways in which indigenous spirituality, indigenous religions, and Christianity had intersected. And that was really interesting to me, in these kind of contact zones of colonization. I remember traveling in Brazil and being super fascinated by the ways in which the Black Brazilian population, who of course had all been enslaved and brought to Brazil, continued to practice Candomblé, which was a African religion, and how that got merged with Catholicism. So I was really interested. This is such a great conversation for me, actually, because what I was mostly interested in is these intersections where different cultures meet. And I realized that that's kind of how I grew up, being very drawn to Jewish culture. I went to all of the bat and bar mitzvahs, and I, got to have Sabbath dinner almost every Friday night because all my friends, were Jewish. And so that was a really important component for me, was sort of, I don't know, just kind of seeing those overlaps for myself. So I was doing my graduate work, my PhD in English, and traveling a lot in South America. By that time, I had, Christianity was out of my life. I would have considered myself very agnostic, spiritual still though, and kind of trying to understand that. But it wasn't, it wasn't something that I was struggling with. There was never a time when I was like, oh my God, I have left the church, or I don't believe in God. I didn't sort of grapple in that way. And I think in part because my mom was never dogmatic. But I remember, I think I had finished my PhD, wanted to do some more traveling, but I decided that I didn't. I made this very specific decision that I had been doing all of my traveling in South American and Catholic countries. And I decided that I wanted to go to a country that decidedly did not practice Catholicism, because one of the things that was oppressive for me traveling in South America was the gender dynamics. And I was curious and